Revolution. The word describes the turmoil engulfing the news industry. The business model's been turned on its head. Digital is changing how journalists do their job. It's also changing the way revolutions themselves are covered, revolutions like the Arab Spring. My guest today has been at the fulcrum point of both of these revolutions. I'm Lawrence Pintack, founding dean of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication, and this is the Murrow Interview. We're taping live today in front of a National High School Journalism Convention in Seattle. My guest, Craig Duff, has been a pioneer in the transition of journalism onto the web. He began his professional life as an award-winning documentary producer for CNN and Turner Broadcasting. He went on to help the New York Times move onto the web, and most recently, he was head of multimedia at Time.com and their chief video journalist. He most recently, though, joined a little-known journalism school somewhere in the Chicago area called Medill. Craig Duff, thanks so much for being with us.
Great to be here. Thanks so much.
You've seen quite a change in journalism.
I have.
In your short little life.
In my short little life. Hopefully it's going to be a longer life from here on out. Yeah, I was thinking that, going from the days when we would go out with a correspondent and a camera person and a sound person, much like the crew here today, and then I would produce, and I would go out and I would have these 300 people to join me in my adventures. And now it's come down to just one person in a backpack. And the kinds of things that I can do now on a laptop and a camera compared to what was possible when I first started, it's just astounding to me, the pace of technological progress. Now we kind of have to get up to speed on the personal progress of being able to make that work. It is a huge load to bear for one person to do it all, but it's been fun trying to figure that out.
How has it changed what you do, from being a documentary producer, to producing video and multimedia content for the web?
These skills in the craft aren't all that much different. I was fortunate to start off in my career early on as a tape editor, and that's a great job because you have to deal with all the stuff that basically trickles down to you, like all the mistakes that are made to the point where it finally gets into the edit room. You have to deal with them and actually make the piece work, regardless of what's happened up to that point. So you learn very quickly as an editor how to avoid those mistakes when you do them yourself. And I've been really fortunate over the years to have good teachers who, in the field, really good photographers that I've worked with and picked up things over the years. What I've learned, I think, is the hard part is it's impossible to do everything well at the same time. And the pace at which we work is really changed. So we kind of have to really focus a lot differently than we did back then. When I was just producing documentaries, I had a specific role, and I could focus on that and really excel at that. I find sometimes now when I'm trying to formulate questions and fiddle with the camera that I ask some really dumb questions sometimes.
But I think you did before as well, right?
Well, I was, it's too arrogant to admit that back then. But then when I'm focusing on the questions, I may not be framing the picture right. So you're having to really be, ambidextrous in ways that you really weren't.
Do you think the reporting part of it suffers?
I think the reporting part of it suffers because you have less time these days to really dig in deep. When I was doing documentaries, I would spend 6 months on one topic. As the multimedia director for Time, I was having things coming at me from all the different, sections of the magazine and the website, different topics of pieces, and just to be an expert in any one of them would be a big challenge. And to have all of them coming at you at once was an even bigger challenge. So, that's really changed quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. You said you were trained, but you've also spent a lot of the last few years as a trainer of print journalists, teaching them all this multimedia stuff. Challenging?
Right. It is. It's interesting that a few things have happened over the past years that have changed the equation. Early on, maybe around 2006, 2007, when newspapers first started doing video for the web, the idea was that, okay, let's get cameras into everybody's hands. And we'll train them a little bit, and we'll send these cameras out to all the bureaus when they had bureaus. And then
we'll come back to that.
But what happened is that yeah, they would get a lot of footage coming in, but then how do you deal with that footage? You know, you get a mess of swish cam video that may have a couple moments in there, but you don't really have a story. And so I think everybody, and then those cameras kind of gathered dust because people didn't really use them. They didn't succeed in getting stuff on the site. And so there was sort of hit or miss. I mean, the Washington Post sent cameras out to all kinds of correspondents. The New York Times did the same thing. But at the same time, the Times developed a really good team of video journalists who were doing it really well. So while all those cameras were gathering dust, a couple of things happened in the last couple years which really changed the equation. The first is the DSLR camera, which meant that photographers who at one time, if they wanted to do video, would have to pull another camera out, and they would always forget to bring it, or it just wasn't part of their workflow, now had the same camera that could shoot video and stills. So they could just push a button and suddenly be able to do video. So that changed the equation a little bit. There was a huge learning curve there because it's a very different style, and shooting video is very different from shooting stills. And there was so you would get the same kind of thing. You get a few shots in video. But eventually that storytelling, now we're seeing amazing pieces being done by photojournalists. And then the other thing that really happened in terms of the individual reporters is the smartphone. The ability to take that iPhone out and become a broadcaster now, in addition to doing your field reporting. You can take photographs with it, you can record audio on it, and you can use it even in a live situation, Skyping an interview. The Wall Street Journal is really good at this. They have actually, given iPhones to a lot of the reporters. They have a live show every day. They actually have a really amazing iPad app, WSJ Live, and they have live programs, and then they tape them and repeat them on demand on the website. But they have their reporters accustomed now to using smartphones and speaking, and basically debriefing stories. So I think we've seen an evolution of sending out these cameras that didn't quite work, but then technology changed and allowed us to do things differently. And I think where we're at now is that we're seeing more and more live video online, and we're seeing reporters being much more comfortable with that other thing, this smartphone being their reporting device. I have a little prediction, okay. And that is that...
Crystal ball.
Right, there it is. In the future, video journalism will be indistinguishable from journalism. And that means, what I mean by that is that essentially all these people who are now accustomed to using a smartphone, and video is just part of what you do as a reporter, and we can get into more of that later, but basically it'll be so ubiquitous as part of what we do, and people will expect a camera to be a part of what you do when you come to their house and record, or you won't be kicked out of the photo pool for shooting something with your iPhone and putting it on the web. So I think more and more, as we become more comfortable with the technology, it'll become much, much more part of what any reporter does across the spectrum.
You mentioned the skill set. Certainly, as we're here in front of a high school journalism convention, these students, hopefully, will be going to J schools where they are learning all of these skills. What about these old codgers that are out there working for the Times and Time Magazine, et cetera? How do you get them across?
Well, I think that's where the skilled video journalists work in tandem with the really highly skilled, great reporters. I mean, you have to look at it that way. You cannot get them to. You can't expect somebody who's been scribbling their whole lives to actually suddenly become great at carrying a camera around. But you can get them to say, okay, let's look at your story here and figure out what paragraph in here is the point at which you say, wouldn't it be cool to see that? And at that moment, you say, okay, well, let's send a video crew out and either recapture this or try to be in that moment. If you're going to be going out on a story and there's going to be things happening that move and make noise, well, let's get our video crew out there and work in tandem with you. And to really develop that cross-platform acuity in these people as opposed to making them completely skilled at the craft itself. Let them be what they are as specialists and then find a way to bring that specialty to life in another platform.
When you first started to do this, I know you went out as the guy who, in tandem with the print reporter, how closely were you working? Were you working in parallel? How welcome were you?
It depends. Early on, you're viewed with suspicion because, at the newspaper, you're sort of this, what are you doing here? We put ink on paper, that's what we do, And so you have to get over that sort of hurdle and be respected as a journalist among equals, and that took some doing. I think it depends on the individual and their sort of enthusiasm and interest. And it's one thing for an editor to say, okay, yeah, you go out with the correspondent, you guys meet and work together. It's another for the interest of that person to actually allow you in. So it depends. I just did a story with the New York Times a couple of weeks ago with reporter Susan Solney in South Bend, Indiana, and she had done a lot of the reporting, gave me the phone numbers of people that she had already spoken to. We met briefly on the scene, but I went out and did my own interviews with the same individuals.
So you're basically replicating her story or using her story as the foundation
Right.
for a video story.
But still trying to find those parts of the story that made the most sense for video. And that's really key. You can't do video for every story, and some things really work great in print, and other things just don't work at all. And some things are really wonderful in video, but you try to write them and it loses something in that translation. Video, of course, is amazing for seeing how things work and seeing how people work, and for finding you can talk about the facts, but finding someone who shows you what it's like to live with the facts on video is really what you're going for. And so, and understanding that kind of the balance there between those two different platforms, I think, is key. Some people have really, like Andy Revkin, who was a science reporter at the New York Times and is now at Pace University and still does the .Earth blog, was very into video. He went to the North Pole and shot video of himself, putting his camera in a
heating. You're doing something similar.
Well, yeah, I ended up doing a documentary with him later, but yeah, he was very much an early adopter of this sort of thing. So you really try to get some traction. You work with those guys first, and then eventually get the others to come along.
One of the New York Times columnists was at the forefront as well, right?
You mean Nick Kristof?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he, basically there's some things he's doing lately that have been extraordinary. Adam Ellick, a video journalist with the Times, with him in Bahrain, things were flying around them. They were detained, separately in two different cars. And and he understands that allows him to tell a story in a different way. And he really, I think Nick really gets, how it can work to complement his reporting.
Mm-hmm. You said that it'll no longer be print or broadcast. It's all journalism. Elaborate on that.
Well, I mean, it's something that we struggle with in the industry, and it's something we're grappling with right now at Medill. How do you, what is the journalist today? And there's been this talk about this word, this phrase, platform agnosticism, meaning that we don't care what platform it goes on. Reporting is reporting; it can go wherever it wants. Now, I think when Arthur Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, was using that phrase several years ago, I think he was thinking about print reporting and all that. But it's interesting because Vivian Schiller, who's the head of digital for NBC News now, she was previously the CEO of NPR. She was recently at a conference and was talking about the fact that platform agnosticism is really just dead now. That you really have to be much more focused on what the strengths of that platform are and channel your reporting for that platform. You can't just put everything out there. That's what magazines did sometimes with the iPad originally. They sort of laid the design onto the iPad, and you're trying to read the magazine on the iPad. A lot of magazines learn to enliven that and make it much more exciting and really work with that medium. And some are doing it, some are not. So she suggested being platform orthodox, and then one of the other people on the panel said platform committing to that platform. And now, of course, there are different video platforms. And so if you're creating something for a mobile device, maybe subtitles don't work so well on there. If you're talking about the iPad, it's a different sort of lean back experience as opposed to a lean forward experience when you're at your computer or watching television. So you can't just assume that putting the same video piece in all those different places is going to work. But coming back to how you train a journalist to sort of in that platform committed environment, you can't be amazing at every single thing. So people are going to specialize. But what I would hope is that any graduate coming out of a J school, particularly Medill, is...
Or Murrow.
Or Murrow, sorry. Yeah. Is that they come out with platform dexterity. And that means that essentially, yes, you are focusing on magazine journalism or you're focusing on broadcast journalism, but you also know how to write. And people who are good writers, and this has been true, I'm sure, in your career throughout the years, and you're an excellent writer, and I'm sure this is how you actually moved your career forward. An excellent writer in broadcast journalism will surpass someone who's just really good at video journalism and maybe not as good a writer. So my goal is to sort of make video journalists better journalists and journalists better video. So when I was at Time, I was looking for VJs with a capital J. I wanted to make sure that they understood journalism and just didn't pick up a camera that mom and dad bought them and were suddenly a storyteller. And now I'm interested in making sure that the VJs have that the people who are focused on the J part have a capital V. And they may not be equally adept at all this stuff, but to really understand it so that at least you can shoot a sequence of footage with your iPhone when you go out and do something, for 15 minutes or whatever, to convey that sense of what's happening there. You may not be able to create a documentary that's 8 minutes long and with the nuance that someone who focused on that their whole life can do, but you know enough about it to be able to play in that arena and across all these platforms.
Are we back in the dark ages when network news were crews with 4 or 5 people out in the field, a correspondent, I'd be out with a producer, I'm reporting the story, the producer's worrying about the logistics and probably maybe even just editing the story. We then moved into this period where we have to be all things to all people. Are we kind of cycling through that at a pretty astounding rate back to a place where, while these young journalists will need to have all of the skills, they will still have a degree of specialization, and ultimately there will still be in the background a producer, a news chief, or whatever, who's deciding how this is packaged, because the reporter may not be required to do the repurposing for the mobile platform, et cetera, et cetera.
You're going to have that because it's impossible to do it otherwise. I think there's just the workload, it's been increasing and increasing. And, now as a reporter, you're going to be reporting your story, then probably tweeting something quickly, maybe doing some audio of it, and then taking some pictures. You're more likely to have to know everything the smaller the organization is you work for. Mm-hmm. If you're a local reporter for a mid-market newspaper.
In Boise or somewhere.
Yeah, so you're going to have to probably, basically wear all the hats. You can wear a fancier hat at a place like Time and just have a couple of them in your closet. So we don't expect people, for instance, that are producing and writing for Time.com to do video every single time they go out. We'll figure out ways to get them, paired up with someone to do that.
Are most newspapers, and I'm speaking newspapers now, do most newspapers have some kind of a multimedia chief?
It's interesting. Sometimes it's with the photo desk. Sometimes a lot of newspapers have deals with local stations, or sometimes they're owned by the same company. So it depends. It's interesting. I was just giving a presentation at Medill a couple of weeks ago, and I looked up a blog from 2007, which listed all the newspapers, and there were dozens and dozens that had a staff video journalist. And then I tried to find which of these stations still had the staffers. Some of the newspapers actually on that list no longer exist, like the Rocky Mountain News, but very, very few of them still had the staff that they had in 2007. There was this sort of ballooning of video journalism that happened, particularly at newspapers, in around 2007, 2008. Of course, finances changed in 2008. That sort of fell off. But there's always going to be a desire for video journalism because you can charge a higher advertising rate for it, a cost per 1,000 viewers. You're sort of captive. You have to watch that ad first before you can go on and watch the piece. So advertisers like that. So there's always going to be a desire for it. The challenge has been to be able to pay to create something that advertisers like, that's a high enough quality, that you believe is good journalism, that you feel proud of, that you don't go over the budget of the amount of money you're bringing in. So it's a calculus that we're still kind of working through.
In this area of cutbacks in the media, you were at Time.com until relatively recently. Mm-hmm. Obviously, all of American journalism has contracted. American journalism, as a former foreign correspondent, particularly sensitive to the fact that we hardly cover the world anymore. There's very few boots on the ground out there. What did you see as the evolution at Time, and what led you to leave?
What led me to leave was a great opportunity to go out and sort of build on the training that I had been doing. And there were challenges there, I'll admit that. But I'm very proud of the people who are still there doing it. I think it's a matter of like really being truly committed to following through on it. A lot of folks now are doing live broadcasts of sort of, they're all in on that. Newsweek and Daily Beast together have created video. Huffington Post is doing a whole series starting this summer. They're going to be doing 12 hours of programming a day on the web. Wall Street Journal. So I think it's just a matter of the investment. They really weren't, there's some struggles there, so. But I think in terms of the industry itself, I mean, I wouldn't dare teach anybody if I weren't optimistic. And so I feel really good about where we are now in journalism. I think there was probably a false economy for a lot of years, particularly in newspapers, where they were making money like crazy on advertising. And I think the web really shook that up, and we will never get to the point where web advertising or digital advertising rates will equal what a double-page spread in the print version was, and the amount of money that came in. But it eventually will shake out. But in terms of the industry itself, what's been interesting, for instance, CNN has recently had some cutbacks. Last year, they decided to get rid of a lot of news photographers and editors. And their reasoning was that they have a whole series of iReporters out there that they've worked on very hard on using citizen journalism, essentially, and they're using affiliate material. So they felt that if they could use that, plus the fact that the network has really shifted to more of a talk format, there's not as much, in the field reporting, except, when things are happening, they send a very robust team to go cover it, whether it's.
But it is hard on a regular basis to just flip on CNN and expect to find news. Yeah,
well, yeah. They're talking about what's on the news, but that's, right. That's somebody's reporting it out there, but, it's get talked about. So what is interesting about that, though, is how do you rely on, and maybe we can, this was a way to talk about what's been happening in the Middle East. Citizen journalism, is economical, but it's also, actually can be quite helpful, and it's just a matter of how you manage it and how you deal with it. And it's actually not that easy, necessarily. There's lots of stuff coming in. You've been watching what's been happening in Syria, for instance. A lot of what we're being able to see what's happening in Syria is because there are people on the ground that are shooting video of it. But it's really hard on outside when you don't know the person who's shooting that. You don't know what the situation really is. How do you verify what's happening there? And realize, of course, that you're getting only one side of the story. I mean, people really do want their story to be told, and they prefer that only their story got told, and so they're putting video out there. And we've had incidents recently of one person faking, setting some tires on fire behind him to make smoke rise, to make it look more dramatic. There's already, it's pretty much a lot of drama there. You don't need to dramatize what's happening. It's awful. But he felt it would help his case better. So it's a bit of a setback.
This is the Murrow Interview. I'm Lawrence Pinsack. My guest is Craig Duff of the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, and most recently was head of multimedia at Time.com. We're taping in front of a live audience at a National High School Journalism Conference. This issue of citizen journalism, particularly, let's talk about the Middle East. Right. And full disclosure, you were a Knight International Journalism Fellow at a center that I was running at the American University of Cairo a few years ago. So we both had a little bit of exposure to this issue of citizen journalism in the region. Right. Is it an oxymoron? Let's start there. The
citizen journalism. Yeah. Like citizen's arrest. It's not an oxymoron. It is, but it's a heap of a grain of salt. It's
a heap of a grain of salt. Nice line. Okay.
Heap of grains of salt. Yeah. I guess. Yeah. So anyway, you really have to manage it properly. Now, having said that, I viewed the events in the Arab Spring, the things were happening in Tahrir Square, which happened to be where the university was when we were both there. So I would go there every day, and so I was watching it basically not in the conventional way. I wasn't tuning in to CNN. I was at my desk at Time reading Twitter feeds, looking at Facebook updates, seeing video that was posted either on YouTube or through actual people's smartphones through something called Bamboozer or TwitVid. little clips of video. So I was sort of putting together this collage in my head of what was happening there based on people that I know.
Then isn't that important? I mean, I was exactly going to touch on that because you know the players.
Yeah.
You know the bloggers, you know the digital activists in Egypt. So you know who is trustworthy, who has a political axe to grind, who falls somewhere in the middle,
right,
versus who's a propagandist, pure and simple.
Yeah, exactly. And my hope is that anybody who's covering that and using that as a source would also know. And but for
we can live in hope,
right? But individuals, may not know that, but they also may not know to follow those people either. So, following Wael Abbas, who's a very famous blogger there, or Hossam al-Hamalawi, different folks who were posting things regularly. Ala Abdel Fattah, who was one of the main protesters there, and you can sort of realize what their point of view in each of those places was, and then to look at the coverage from the outside. So for me, it was a very vivid experience piecing all that together in my head. And then I had to put another hat on and say, okay, well, here I am as as the multimedia editor here, overseeing video pieces that are coming in. And I had video journalists who were on the ground there, sending pieces in too, or working with Times correspondent on the ground. I really wasn't able to make use of the citizen journalism that was coming in because I didn't have the staff or the time to deal with it. What's happened in the last couple of years is user-generated content desks are opening up at places like the BBC and CNN. And they will have basically a staff, like CNN I believe has 8 people who monitor all the stuff coming in. First of all, CNN has a portal, the iReport portal. Anybody can put their video up there and be part of that community. That if you watch it, a little thing comes up and says, we haven't vetted this, we don't know if it's real, this is an iReport from an iReporter, heap a grain of salt. But then when they want to take that from that iReport milieu and move it over to CNN.com or put it on the air, that's when those 8 producers kick in. And they will vet it, and part of the deal is you have to actually put your name and contact information in there. They'll contact the reporter first, the iReporter, and then try to verify it. They'll call other sources and make sure that it's real. BBC, and then there are other things too, like BBC and a website called Storyful, which the New York Times and ABC use to help verify video pieces. They'll do almost like forensics. They will actually look at a piece of video coming in from Syria, for instance, and they will look at Google Maps and the camera and try to match up what places a corner looks like. Is this really where it was said it was shot? Listen to the accents of the Arabic to make sure that it is Syrian dialect in that particular area. They will call other sources, try to see, has this person posted a lot of video before? Have other people trusted them before? So it's really a calculus of making sure that what you're actually seeing is the real deal.
Because there have been incidents where news organizations have been burned.
Oh yeah, many. But I was thinking about, particularly in Syria, in 1982, when the father of the current president, Hafez al-Assad, there was a massacre at Hama, and I'm sure you covered this.
I covered it. Well, covered it, and that's exactly your point, covered it in quotes, because I was sitting as a CBS correspondent in Beirut, and this was happening 100 miles from Beirut, less than 100 miles, and we had no idea what was going on. And in those days, we had no video, and for TV, if you've got no video, you got no story.
Right, and there are virtually no photographs of what happened there. Bashar al-Assad can't get away with that. I mean, he's getting away with a lot.
But
a hell of a lot. But he can't quite operate under the cloak.
People are seeing it. That's the difference.
People are seeing it. And people are very, very smart at making sure that people do get it seen. I mean, a lot of folks got hurt and died helping journalists get in there and cover the story. I mean, yes, journalists died. It's terrible. But a lot of other people died too, trying to help them out and either get them out of the country or get them in. It's...
And really, in Syria, there is this emergence of a new hybrid. We talk about citizen journalists and digital activists, but some of these people really have made the transition on their own at some level.
Yeah, I mean, they're activist journalists, and whatever ist you want to add to it. And it's a matter of the technology allowing us to do this. It's always the drive of individuals to get the story told, and and also just the way things have changed in social media and all that allows us sort of to get disseminated among news organizations, whereas one network may have had the tape a long time ago. Now, allows everybody sort of to play with the material that's coming out of there and verify it on their own and tell the story on their own in a way that makes sense for them, whether they're BBC or Voice of America.
Syria is, by the way, this is the Murrow interview. I'm Lawrence Pintack. My guest is Craig Duff of Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern and most recently head of multimedia news at Time.com. Give us a little peek inside the planning at Time. So, meet on a weekly basis, presumably, at least, and you talk about covering Syria. What's that conversation look like?
Well, it's actually not quite as elaborate as you might think. It's basically, gosh, is there anyone there? Or I'll get a call from, a freelancer, for instance, in Beirut, who's found a way to get somewhere close. And we have a discussion about, okay, well, if you go in there, what are you going to do? How are you going to protect yourself? There's all kinds of things that go into that, particularly in Syria. And we didn't have anybody go into Syria. Rana Abu Zaid, who's a freelance correspondent who writes for Time, I think she's a contractor, did go in. She sometimes will shoot video on her own, but she didn't this time. So there it's like, the dangers of getting in there. Whereas like a Libya where Don Duncan was going from Beirut to, he's going to be in Tunisia and Libya, and we figured out 4 stories that he could do economically. If we did 4, then I could spread the money around and we could actually fund part of his trip. He was also getting money from other sources.
The multimedia desk.
Yeah, multimedia desk, at Time. So we could, we did 4 pieces. He did 2 inside of Libya and 2 in Tunisia. This was just a few weeks after Gaddafi had been captured. And so, working with the freelancers there, we didn't really have, we have a correspondent in Cairo and we have a correspondent in Beirut, but we don't, those are the print correspondents. We don't really have, a staff apparatus there, and we don't send anybody anywhere anymore. We try to find people who were already...
Which is a sad statement.
Yeah, it is. But Larry, I think it's for people who are wanting to be foreign correspondents or cover international news, it's an opportunity. As a freelancer, and whether you're a video journalist or you're trying to be a multimedia journalist and cover all the bases, you can succeed if you find a place where you can become the local expert. Because otherwise, people are sort of parachuting in, and if you can be the one who knows the stuff on the ground, and whether you're in Nigeria, for instance, or Mali, for instance, wouldn't it be great if you were sitting in Mali and you knew the country really well, and then this stuff happens in the northern deserts, and you could be the one who was there. So it gives you an opportunity to be the expert. And if you can deal with the complexity of a place, you're going to be a better reporter than someone who's parachuting in. I used to think that Lebanon was the most complex place in the whole region. I mean, looking at it, from when I was at my time in Cairo, Lebanon's an incredibly complex country. The history of how it was set up, the factions of groups there, the sort of 2 main Christian factions, the Shia, then the Sunni, and the Druze, all mixed together in this little sliver of land. The joke is that 2 people met on the street in Beirut and they formed 3 political parties.
Each one with a radio station, by the way.
Exactly. And I thought that Egypt was sort of tidier. There was Mubarak and his government, and then everybody else. But now look at how, as you peel that onion, all the sort of nuances, the stuff that was just bubbling under that pot lid, and as soon as Mubarak left, all the stuff that came out, and to really understand that, you need to be there, and to know the players. And so if you can be that person, as no matter what brand of journalism you're doing, I think you can really succeed.
And the other thing as well, that I mean, that's always been the case. I mean, certainly, my career, many people who became foreign correspondents started by going overseas as freelancers somewhere. But the difference now is that there are so many more places you can go where there are not staff correspondents. There are so many more opportunities, right, with a little bit of adventure in your blood.
Yeah, exactly. That's key, and common sense.
Come back to Arab Spring. You were at a time when the Arab Spring broke a year or so ago. What happened in the newsroom? This poor guy lights himself on fire in Tunisia. The flames spread, as it were. How did Time reorient to cover this?
Well, it wasn't like visible, like you kick the anthill and you see the ants scurrying. It didn't really quite work that way. But certainly the international team mobilized, and Bobby Ghosh, who was at the time the deputy world editor, knows the region really well, and Rana Abu Zaid and some other folks who were there. Vivian Walt, who came down from Paris and was in Tunisia early on and covered it. So there was an excitement there and a sort of a motive, suddenly motivated to go out and cover the story. Photojournalists went. Time is very much about the photographs in a lot of ways too. So yeah, but I think it sort of evolved. Like what have happened in Sidi Bouzid when Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire. I don't think anyone would have guessed that it would be possible. I mean, I remember doing a piece with Mona El-Tahawi, who's an Egyptian columnist who we both know, who's become quite a figure since the Arab Spring. But right after the Tunisia event happened, she was talking about all the grandfathers, all these different leaders in the area, and how wouldn't it be great if we can basically all these people, it would motivate a movement across the region so that all these old dictators would suddenly fall. We didn't realize that she was right, or the complexity and how intense it was going to be in each of these places in their own way.
They haven't fallen yet.
Not all of them. Not all of them. There's some that are clinging on. But yeah, I think it was more like sort of like, oh wow, that's pretty extraordinary. And then when Egypt happened, then all that stuff happening in Tahrir Square, then it became very visibly, much more of an exciting and explosive story. And you could see that, sort of more of a pan-regional conflict, story happening, unfolding.
One of the problems often in these kinds of stories is exhaustion in the newsroom, and particularly in the business office. To what extent do you think that's happening now? I mean, are news organizations, from your perspective, continuing that coverage, or is it slacking off, more of the same, and we don't want to spend more money on it?
Well, I mean, last year there was amazing international news. Yeah. I mean, there's tsunami and earthquake and tsunami in Japan. All the stuff that happened in Arab Spring. And a lot of budgets.
There's a couple of wars out there, Afghanistan,
right, and the mess. So budgets were probably spent by June, given all that happened between January and June. So it may have been, sui generis. It might have been just that 1 year happened to be extraordinary. It didn't mean that organizations matched the budget that they spent last year and said, "Oh, good, gosh, you spent $100,000 more than you should have, but here, why don't you do that again this year?" It was like, okay, how are we going to do this with what we actually have? We can't overspend. I think there's the economics are the economics of it, and it's a shame that we don't have the bureaus that we once had, and people are trying to make do with what they can. But there is something, I mean, using the social media realm to cover things, I think, is actually pretty interesting. Look at what Andy Carvin does. Andy is the social media editor for NPR, and he basically made his name through the Arab Spring by being the go-to guy who was sort of seeing all these tweets coming in and different pieces of video and different pieces of information, and managing it all and fact-checking and using the hive mind of the Twitter sphere, if that's a word, to verify information. And I think that allows us to sort of expand out there and tell the story in new ways that help us, because we can't afford to get there ourselves. Did you see the Guardian's ad a couple of months ago about open journalism? Okay, this is worth looking up, you guys. You should Google 3 Little Pigs Guardian. The Guardian's a newspaper in England.
Which has been at the forefront of multimedia journalism.
It's an amazing, yeah, and they have a great staff now. They're basically going after the U.S. market now. Yeah. They've got a great group in New York, actually, the former New York Times multimedia guy is heading that up, Gabe Dance. But this ad is for this notion of open journalism, and it's the three little pigs. It starts off the big bad wolf has been boiled and killed, and so the cameras are swooping in as the pigs are being taken into custody, and they said, well, he blew our houses down, and so we killed it in self-defense. And
did they live in Florida?
Yeah, this was before that. It is an unfortunate comparison, but it turns out the pigs actually killed the wolf because they actually burned down their own houses, blew down their own houses because they were in foreclosure and they were trying to avoid, But the idea of the whole thing, and it's a 2-minute ad, is the idea that all the Twitter feeds are coming in about, people are tweeting about the pigs and about the wolf and about foreclosures and all these things in this vivid little fairy tale that they tell, but it is very real about their approach to news, and that is that they are using the hive mentality of the people who care out there and people who are on the news and commenting about the news and using them as a source in this kind of idea of open journalism. So if you do look at that video piece, also look at the videos on the side of all their editors talking about how they're using these new sort of social media things in ways that help them tell the story better.
So it's rethinking how you source information.
Yeah, turning that into whereas people don't necessarily have a brand identity for an article that they click on Facebook. If you click on a story, you may read the story, but you may not look at the masthead of what you're looking at, what you're reading. You're not married to a brand anymore. You're married to you're appreciating your friend's taste or your people you follow, their taste. And you read the story, and you may not know that it's a Time magazine story or a New York Times story or some obscure blog. So the Guardian actually can create a brand identity because they're actually turning that on its head and saying, okay, no, we're going to use you guys to help us tell the story to get the whole picture.
I'm Lawrence Pintack. You're listening to and watching the Murrow interview. My guest is Craig Duff of Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, former head of Interactive at Time and New York Times and all sorts of things. You mentioned the Guardian's incursion into the U.S. Likewise, The Economist, another British news weekly. Mm-hmm. Are we seeing a blurring of the lines between news organizations? We always had these nationally based, nationally focused news organizations.
Well, I think it's interesting, whereas, cable television has become more partisan and sort of inserting identity, and U.S. media are very much inside. Like I don't know that Fox News has an international strategy. They're very much focused on an American audience. But I think people, or the Guardian and The Economist, they're seeing a market here that they can serve in a way. They're thinking much more globally. Global brands like Time and Newsweek have always had sort of an international versions of their magazines and an international mentality about that.
But still relatively Amerocentric.
Yeah.
The perspective.
Right. I think, and it's interesting about the newspapers in England are much more aligned with a point of view than, what we consider, U.S. newspapers, which are basically, the editorial page will be one thing, but the news itself is supposed to be unbiased and not necessarily taking particularly a political point of view. So we'll see whether that, people pay attention to that sort of thing, the Guardian's, POV when it comes here, or if people just look at it as a really cool place to get the information, because the information is pretty much the same everywhere. It's a matter of how you package it, how you analyze it, and how you think about it.
But likewise, and you throw into this mix the BBC, Al Jazeera English.
Right.
Is this another way that we American news organizations are going to supplement the lack of boots on the ground, the access to information gathered by other news organizations?
Yeah, possibly so. I hadn't really given that part of it much thought. I mean, there are a lot of, like, in the Arab world, there's a lot of national organizations that have TV news channels now. You have France 24 there now, and you've got, you got Al Jazeera English, but then you also have, the Russians and the Chinese have now developed their own news organizations in that region. But that's really more about, influence and politics and economics for the countries themselves.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that. These channels are a bit like maybe Voice of America or the American television channel in the Middle East, Al Hurra. These are government channels that are really out there to get the government's point of view across, and pretty much everybody has them now, right?
Yeah, everybody who is a is a player, and yeah. So I don't think Argentina and Brazil don't have them there yet, but the key players do. Folks who have a vested interest in in not only politics and in geopolitics and economics in that region, or and they're doing them in French, like for instance, France 24 is in French, English, and Arabic now, right? So they're all trying to tailor to that market.
We have a few questions from the audience. Tara Short, and I assume that's a person's name, from, I guess, the Hawkeye, must be a newspaper, somewhere out there, asks,
Iowa?
who are some of the citizen/one-man journalists in the Middle East that you'd suggest following, Twitter, blogs, etc.?
Okay,
So
this requires
people like Wael Abbas, who you mentioned a while back.
Wael is a blogger who has been blogging for a number of years, and he uses video occasionally. I wouldn't really call him necessarily a video journalist, but he certainly does bring video into it.
And he's a digital activist as opposed to a pure journalist.
In fact, his blog is called Mr. Digital, which is Egypt Digital. Yeah, I think that's good. I think a lot of the individuals who are on the ground there doing work are feeding to a lot of different folks. I would basically look at brands like the New York Times has good people on the ground there. Ben Solomon's been doing some pretty good work for them. On the CNN site, there's some good folks. Yeah, but we don't have when Travis Fox was at the Washington Post, he had a big budget for international stories. Travis is no longer there. The budget is no longer there. They've really focused inside the Beltway. So it really is people in the region.
And of course, Anthony Shadid, who was a superb journalist on the Middle East, is of course unfortunately passed away not long ago covering Syria.
Right. Yeah. I'm just reading his book House of Stone, and it's an incredible book.
Another question from the audience: do you think government-affiliated news stations such as the Voice of America contradict the idea of unbiased journalism because they're inherently correlated with the government's agenda?
I think it goes with the territory. I think people look at Voice of America as the Voice of America. They don't look at it as the unbiased voice of something other than a country. So the thing is, like, there is what's the Iranian one? The Iranian one that's
Press TV.
Press TV.
Right.
Doesn't have Iran in the title.
Right.
And it's people speaking in Midwestern accents, and a lot of times, So you may look at that
and a former 60 Minutes producer was hosting a show, this sort of a show on Press TV. Up until it all went bad in Iran with the U.S. recently.
Yeah. So when you look at something like that, if you're just coming to it or someone links you to it, you may not realize that that's an Iranian organization. So that's a problem, I think. Whereas
and this gets back to this, this academic term of media literacy, which simply means you need to know what it is you're consuming, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Another question, because, they were piling up here. Because the power of but you know what I noticed, though, is I'm getting all these big sheets of paper from notebooks and Washington State Convention, but none from reporters' notebooks. What are these high school journalism students doing out there, huh? And these aren't in order, guys. Sorry, I'm juggling them up. You mentioned before that video journalism and journalism will become synonymous. Do you think this holds true of citizen journalism? This is from Carolyn Corcoran from Peoria.
Well, here we get back to the heap of salt. It's, yes, video journalism done by citizens, will be considered equal among journalism that's text that's done by citizens. I'm really talking about the fact that, the ease of using video will become just part and parcel of what we do. Video is the most powerful way to get a story across in a place like Syria where it's happening in front of you, and it's a powerful witness. I think, the danger is that we slack off in how we handle the citizen journalism, and that we have to be ever vigilant and do our due diligence on every single piece of, every frame that comes our way, as news organizations. So as long as that's there, I'm not concerned about, a proliferation of citizen journalism. However, I do think as we sort of wring our hands here and figure out how we can pay journalists to be journalists,
sure.
I think...
Minor detail.
Yeah, minor detail. But I think that'll work itself out. And I think, but we have to realize that citizen journalism, that user-generated content, is going to be part of the mix. And it's vital in places like Syria. I mean, you guys aren't going to go there. So, not now. I mean, I hope to get to Damascus one day. I'd love to see it, but I'm not going there now, So in places like that, it really is vital. And to be at the heart of things as they're happening, while you're waiting for the live truck to get there, if somebody's got the video of it, I think it's always going to be valid to use that.
Will ink on paper media ever completely disappear? Omar from Horizon High in Arizona asks.
I worked with people at time who, if it came down to it, would go out and cut the trees down themselves to keep the paper product. I think it's going to be generational. As long as people prefer it that way, then it's going to be, it will have a market. As long as there's a market for it. However, I think that probably the amount you can charge for a full-page ad is not going to be what it is now or was 10 years ago. It already is not. But I think the idea of holding something in your hand, that tangible thing, and the serendipity of reading a newspaper for me, like even sometimes seeing the ads for a show that I didn't realize was on Broadway or whatever, just as you glance across the page, I see things that I would never have seen on the New York Times app, for instance, because it's so targeted.
Well, there's layers of how you read these things. I mean, if you're reading it on the web, as you're saying, you're not grazing, you're specifying a certain kind of story.
Right.
Maybe 6-8 years ago, I did one of these interviews with Arthur Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, and he had, and for those of you listening on radio, I'm holding up my iPad, he had an early prototype of the iPad, and he said, this is the future of newspapers. This is what will save newspapers.
Right.
And the reality is that we read the app on the iPad, yes, differently than the paper, but it's much more of a grazing process. You're paging through rather than going down into verticals.
Right.
And we pay for it, and we don't feel as bad about paying for it as we feel about paying for something on the web.
That's true. Yeah, and we're seeing now paywalls and paying for apps and things like that. It's slowly getting there. It's interesting that about the iPad in 1996. There was somebody working for one of the major, was it Knight Ridder maybe? It was a think tank that was affiliated with a major news organization, and they actually developed something that was remarkably like that tablet that Arthur mentioned, or like an iPad. And they have a video, actually, you can check this also online. I'm giving you a lot of Googling to do after this talk.
Homework.
Yes, exactly. And it's just Google iPad prototype or whatever, 1996, I think. And it talks about this idea of doing it. Nicholas Negroponte, who wrote a book around that same era, was called Being Digital, who was at the MIT Media Lab, talked about a type of newspaper maybe that would be a paper-like substance that would feed your daily news onto it, and you would actually leaf through it much like you would a newspaper. I think the iPad is very much like that, sort of come to life.
One of our students out there asks, should journalists be using social networking? Should they be tweeting, for example?
Yes. You have to sort of develop your identity and your brand as an individual journalist, and you have to be part of that conversation. It's still a small set of the audience. I mean, Twitter is not like everybody. It's a small set of the audience, but it's a very influential part of the audience. It is the people who are most engaged in the news, and so you have to address them. But you have to be careful. I mean, people have screwed up their careers by using the wrong word to discuss someone from Hezbollah, for instance. So you have to do it. I sort of use it. I created my blog so that my mom would know what I was up to, and I could put pictures on it. And that's unfortunately continued. I don't use the blog to do much more than just sort of show where I've been and what I've been doing. And I use Twitter basically just for the fun of it. I don't use it much in my professional work. I do some. I tweet occasionally, things that come across my transom. But usually I'm just making jokes, on there.
I mean, part of the problem with tweeting is not thinking. It's kind of like think before you speak, think before you tweet.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Roland Martin, probably, the things you do at a Super Bowl party is, you might drink a couple beers. You might not want to be tweeting when you're doing that, sort of thing.
And because we're taping in front of a high school journalism group, I have to ask the classic question that, of course, a few sent up. What advice do you give to a student wanting to go into journalism and/or international journalism?
Yeah, it's been a rough week for journalism, and talking about it as a career. There was a list this week of the 200 best and worst jobs, and the worst, in the journalism and broadcasting were in the bottom 20. Journalism was 196. The worst was lumberjack. and broadcaster, and then there's taxi driver and waitress. There's all the server, table server, and then there was broadcast was like 190 something between shoe repairman and butcher. So but the thing is, I know a guy in my neighborhood who's a really good butcher, and he loves it. And he, has a great time, and he does a good business.
I've heard journalists accused of being butchers.
Exactly right. Yeah, and I think it really comes down to do what you love, and the money will follow. And I think people who are insatiably curious and want to figure out the world and help other people figure it out along with them, and help all of us understand the world better. There's nothing better than a job as a journalist. We both have had such privileged careers to be able to do that at major news organizations, and jobs will still be there in those places.
And this is a fascinating time in the evolution of journalism.
Totally. Yeah, he said, using a youthful adverb. It's totally a good time. It's not only technologically you're able to do things that we couldn't do 20 years ago, but also it's just so much is just happening in the world. The world's so interconnected in new ways that's just fascinating. And I think for international journalism, if you really want to be a foreign correspondent, it's going to be, there are fewer and fewer of those jobs at the salary level with health insurance and things like that. You're going to have to probably make it on your own, at least at first. But if you can allow yourself, be the expert, as I said earlier, and figure out the complexities of that place, speak the language, that's key. I think everyone here should be learning another language.
Absolutely. I mean, this is certainly my generation, and I'm a bit older than you are, my generation of foreign correspondents. Relatively few of us spoke the languages,
right.
And now it is essential.
Yeah, I mean, Americans get a bad rap around the world. Like they say, well, what do you call a person who speaks 3 languages? A polyglot or trilingual. 2 languages, bilingual. 1 language, American. It's because the states are so big, and whereas in Europe, if you're in Germany and you're right next to France and in Netherlands and all that stuff, you sort of are speaking different languages, and you're much more, the education systems, were set up so that you could live in that continent. In America, everyone speaks English, and so we didn't really have to. I think now, though, if you really do want to be a foreign correspondent, Mandarin is a good choice. Arabic, certainly. Spanish, I think, actually would be an interesting choice, not necessarily to cover Latin America, but to cover America in the next 20 years. If you just look at the census, and the projections of the census data, you'll have many more Spanish-speaking people in this country. And it could be a huge boon to you, depending on what market you're in.
And the other thing about journalism is that you can, as the Arab Spring shows us, as a journalist, you can still help to change the world.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly.
Craig Duff, thanks so much for being with us. Craig Duff is a professor at that also-ran J School, the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, and former head of multimedia at Time.com. I'm Lawrence Pintack, and this has been the Murrow Interview in front of a live audience of high school journalism students in Seattle.
Good night, and good luck.